Tim Goldstein, autistic adult, and your host for Life in a Neurotypical Universe, where we take a look at life from the perspective of an autistic adult. Just as in life, we never quite know where things are going to go and what we're going to run into. Same happens here in Life in a Neurotypical Universe. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the chapter that I wrote for a book that I co-authored and co-edited along with Dr. Santoshi Halder from the University of Calcutta and Dr. Dave Caudel from Frist Center of Autism and Innovation at Vanderbilt. Together, we did a book that's titled Inclusion and Autism, Neurodiverse Autistic First-Person Accounts, which is a collection of different chapters, each one written by a different author, with all of them being autistic, except Dr. Santoshi, I don't believe, identifies that way, or at least never has directly to me. So, a very, very interesting book put out by Routledge Publishing as an academic book. And you can get the link down in the show notes if you want to check out some more. But I went and took my chapter, which this was, we'll have to say, when I agreed to do it way back in 2000 when Dr. Santoshi first suggested the idea. It sounded like a great idea. And then I found out I had to write an 8,000-word chapter, which is pretty much like writing a whole book. And I went and wrote my chapter. Now I went and ran it through Google's Notebook LM, where it goes and it creates a podcast conversation. And it turned into a really fascinating conversation. So I'm sharing my chapter out of the book through Notebook LM's podcast version of what I said. It certainly condenses it down, but does a great job of giving you an impression of what the chapter's about. And if you want to get the whole thing, well, you got to get the book. So come on, dive in and let's listen to the characters on Google's Notebook LM as they discuss the chapter written by me. And it's kind of funny as I listen to it as they talk about what Goldstein had to say, but I think it came out pretty darn well, and I think you'll enjoy. Sit back, have your favorite beverage, and listen to what generative AI brings us from the chapter that I wrote.
Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a big one, neurodiversity, specifically looking at autism from an autistic perspective.
Sounds fascinating.
And to help us with that, we're going to be looking at writings by Tim Goldstein. He's an autistic advocate who created something called the NeuroCloud model.
The NeuroCloud?
Yeah, have you heard of this?
I have, yeah. It's a really interesting way to visualize neurodiversity.
Yeah, and that's really what we're hoping to do in this deep dive, right, is to understand how autistic individuals experience the world and how that can help all of us, move towards a more inclusive world.
Absolutely. I think Goldstein's work is so important because it really challenges a lot of the assumptions that we have about autism.
Yeah, I think he even pushes back on the idea that there is a right way to think and a wrong way to think,
right.
What's normal and what's not.
Exactly. He really gets us away from that deficit-based view of autism that, we often see.
Right.
And he helps us to appreciate these different ways of thinking and being,
So let's talk about this NeuroCloud model a little bit.
Okay.
How does it actually help us visualize this concept of neurodiversity?
So you can picture as this big cloud, right? And that represents like all human brains.
Okay.
Within that cloud, you have all these different clusters, kind of like in a real cloud.
Gotcha.
And so Goldstein says, one of those clusters represents neurotypical brains.
Okay.
And that's the cluster that sort of sets the dominant social norms, right?
Right.
And then you have all these other clusters, and those represent what he calls neurodistinct brains.
Uh-huh.
So those are the folks who perceive and process information differently.
And I think that's such a key point, right? Because so often people see neurodiversity or being neurodistinct as a negative thing.
Right.
But what he's saying is, no, it's just variation.
It is. It's just variation, like with any other human trait.
Yeah.
Take eye contact, for example.
Uh-huh.
We all have eyes, right? But how we use eye contact varies so much depending on our culture. our personal preferences, even the situation that we're in.
Totally. And even thinking about, within one culture, like here in the United States, sometimes extended eye contact feels normal and natural, and other times it's like the most awkward thing in the world.
Right, exactly. It all depends on the context.
So even something as seemingly simple as eye contact, it's a spectrum.
It's not just like you do it this way or you do it that way.
It's not black and white.
Right.
And I think that's what Goldstein's work really highlights, right, is that so many of these things that we associate with autism are actually just human traits that are expressed differently.
Exactly. And one of the ways that he really drives this point home is by looking at the DSM-5, the manual that's used to diagnose mental health conditions.
Oh, yeah. I'm really fascinated by this part of his work because he really digs into the DSM-5 and kind of critiques it from his lived experience as an autistic adult, right?
He does. And he points out all these places where his experience doesn't match up with what the DSM-5 describes.
Okay.
Like, for example, one of the key criteria for diagnosing autism in the DSM-5 is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah, but Goldstein argues that these aren't deficits, but rather challenges with interpretation and input.
So it's not that he can't do it.
Right.
It's that he processes it differently.
Exactly. He processes it differently, and that's what leads to these differences in behavior.
So I'm wondering, what does that look like, in his daily life? What are some examples of this?
He gives the example of social give and take.
Okay.
Like that back and forth, in conversation.
Right.
And he says sometimes it's a challenge for him and sometimes it's not.
Okay.
It really depends on who he's interacting with and the situation.
Okay.
And he makes the point that even neurotypical individuals can have trouble with social interaction. Some people are just naturally better at it than others.
That's true. Like, I know plenty of people who just aren't great at like reading social cues or, whatever it might be.
Exactly.
But we don't label them as having a disorder.
Right.
Just because of that.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that Goldstein is really pushing back against. He's saying this is a human experience.
Right.
This isn't something that's unique to autism.
Totally. So social give and take is one example, but the DSM-5 also points to things like nonverbal communication,
Right.
facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, as being difficult for autistic individuals to interpret. So how does Goldstein address that?
He points out that he tends to take words very literally, and so he might miss the emotional subtext that neurotypicals are often picking up on.
So he's really focused on like the actual words that are being said.
On the factual accuracy of the words.
Yeah, rather than like the underlying feeling or emotion.
Yeah, and so he talks about how he's had to develop this strategy that he calls emotional speaking.
Emotional speaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where he actually intentionally adds vocal tone to convey emotion because he knows that that's what neurotypicals are really cueing into.
So he's almost like translating his communication style.
Yeah, it's like he's bridging that gap.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like a conscious effort on his part.
Wow. So what about relationships? Because that's another thing that the DSM-5 kind of points to as a, diagnostic criteria is difficulties with relationships.
Right. And Goldstein actually challenges this too.
Okay.
He says relationship struggles are a universal human experience.
Yeah.
He's not denying that he has had difficulties in relationships, but he's saying, this isn't something that's unique to autistic people.
Right.
Everyone has trouble with relationships at some point.
Yeah, for sure.
And he talks about how he finds really deep connection in a smaller number of friendships that are based on shared interests.
Yeah.
Which, again, is something that a lot of people can relate to.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us, as we get older, we realize we'd rather have a few really close friends than, a ton of acquaintances.
Exactly.
So it's not like an autistic thing or a neurotypical thing. It's just a human thing.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people have this misconception that autistic people are unemotional or incapable of forming these deep bonds.
Right.
But Goldstein actually addresses that directly.
Okay.
He shares this really personal story about his relationship with his mother and how his priorities shifted when she became terminally ill.
Wow.
And it really highlights that, autistic people experience the full range of human emotions.
Right.
It's just that they may express them or prioritize them differently.
Yeah. It's so powerful. And it really reminds us that you can't just make assumptions about somebody's emotional capacity based on, a label or a diagnosis or whatever.
Right.
So I'm really glad that he included that in his writings.
I am too.
So we've talked about, how the NeuroCloud model and his experiences kind of reframe these social and communication aspects. Yeah.
But the DSM-5 also lists, restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities as like a key characteristic of autism. And so I'm curious to hear how Goldstein challenges that as well.
So this is where that idea of autistic traits being human traits expressed differently really comes into play.
Okay.
He says, everyone engages in repetitive behaviors. Everyone seeks comfort in routines. Everyone develops strong interest.
Sure.
It's the degree and the manner in which these things are expressed that differs.
Okay.
So it's not that autistic people are the only ones who do these things.
Right.
It's just that they might do them differently or to a different extent.
Okay, so let's get into some specific examples because, there's this common misconception that autistic people love repetition.
Yeah.
Like they just, want to do the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
How does Goldstein address that?
He uses a really great example from his own life.
Okay.
He talks about how he used to work in a lab.
And he actually really enjoyed a task called precise aliquoting.
Aliquoting?
Yeah, it involves like measuring out exact amounts of liquid.
Okay.
Repeatedly.
Okay.
But what he enjoyed about it wasn't the repetition itself.
Okay.
It was the precision and the skill that it required.
So it was the challenge.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And he compares this to how gamers will often repeat the same actions in a video game,
Okay.
They're not doing it just for the repetition.
Right.
They're doing it for the challenge.
A mastery.
The mastery.
So it's about the underlying motivation.
Exactly.
Not just the surface level behavior, which
Right.
I think is so important because, we often observe people's behaviors and we make assumptions about why they're doing things without really understanding what's going on inside.
Right. And that's what Goldstein is trying to get us to see.
Yeah.
Is that there's more to the story than meets the eye.
And that's where the DSM, I think, falls short.
Yeah.
Because it's really just focused on the behavior.
Right. It's very focused on the observable behavior.
Without that context.
Without the internal experience.
Right. And another example of that is this idea that autistic people are inflexible with routines, which, again, is a stereotype that gets thrown around a lot.
Yeah.
So how does Goldstein address that?
He argues that everyone needs routine to some extent.
Okay.
He points out that the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted this.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of people who had never considered themselves to be particularly routine-oriented
Right.
really struggled with the disruptions to their daily lives.
Yeah. I mean, everybody was thrown for a loop.
Exactly.
So it showed that, that need for routine, that need for predictability, it's not an autistic thing, it's a human thing.
It's a human thing, exactly.
Yeah.
We all need some level of structure and predictability in our lives.
Totally. And I think that's such an important point to make.
Yeah.
So how does Goldstein address this concept of restricted interests?
Okay.
Because that's another one that, I think comes up a lot.
Yeah, and he does this in a really brilliant way.
Okay.
He compares his own really deep interest in maker culture and synthetic biology to the widespread enthusiasm for fantasy sports.
Okay.
And he says, it's not the intensity of the interest that's the problem.
Right.
It's how society judges and values those interests.
Whoa, interesting.
So, one person's obsession is another person's passionate hobby.
Right.
It all depends on, whether we deem an interest to be acceptable or weird.
I love that.
Yeah. It's a really thought-provoking comparison.
It is.
And it gets us to question, why do we judge certain interests as being more valid than others?
Totally.
And then he also touches on sensory processing differences, which are often associated with autism.
Right.
But he emphasizes that while sensory processing disorder, or SPD, is more common in autistic people, it's actually more prevalent in the general population than just in autistic individuals.
So again, it's not like an autistic thing versus a non-autistic thing.
Exactly. It's just that autistic people may be more likely to experience it or experience it to a greater degree.
And this is where I think this neurocloud model really shines, right? Because it's not creating this hard line between autistic and neurotypical.
Right.
It's saying that, we all share these human traits.
Yeah.
We just express them differently.
All about variation.
Yeah. And understanding that variation is what's going to allow us to create, a more inclusive and accommodating world.
Absolutely.
So this has been a really eye-opening start to our deep dive.
Yeah.
And, we've really just scratched the surface of Goldstein's work.
Yeah, we have.
But we've already seen how, this neurocloud model and his own personal experiences really challenge some of these fundamental assumptions about autism that are often presented in the DSM-5.
They do.
So I'm curious to kind of explore this further.
Yeah.
How does Goldstein suggest we move away from this deficit-based view of autism and actually create a more neurodiversity-affirming society?
Great question.
We'll dive into that in our next segment, so stay tuned.
Well, I think Goldstein's work is really interesting here because he doesn't just want to, deconstruct these misconceptions.
Right.
He actually wants to offer a roadmap for how we can actually build a more inclusive society.
So what does that look like? Where do we even begin?
Well, he says one of the most important things is understanding the autistic approach to communication.
Okay.
And he really highlights the preference for precise, literal language, which can be really challenging because, neurotypical communication often relies so heavily on emotional subtext and implied meanings.
Right. It's all about what's not being said.
Exactly.
What's underneath, reading between the lines.
And so you can see how that would create a lot of misunderstandings.
For sure. So I'm thinking back to what you were saying earlier about, his emotional speaking strategy.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? How does that actually work in practice?
So he explains that because he knows that neurotypicals are often cueing into tone of voice and, kind of that emotional layer.
Yeah.
He actually intentionally modulates his tone of voice to convey emotion.
Wow.
Even though, that's not necessarily how he's processing the information internally.
So he's really making a conscious effort to kind of bridge that gap.
He is.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating.
It is amazing.
It's a really deliberate strategy.
I'm wondering, do you think that's something that could be taught or learned?
Mm-hmm.
Could that be a helpful tool for both autistic and neurotypical individuals to kind of...
That's a great question.
...improve communication,
I don't know that Goldstein necessarily addresses that directly.
Okay.
But I do think it raises some really interesting questions about, how we can be more mindful of these different communication styles and how we can be more intentional about the way that we're communicating.
Yeah, and it makes me think about, even in written communication, how much emphasis we put on things like tone of voice and body language, even things like emojis and punctuation. We're trying to convey those nonverbal cues, even in a written format.
Exactly. And you can imagine how that could be really confusing for someone who processes language literally.
Totally.
They're looking at the words and they're not necessarily picking up on all of those other layers of meaning.
And Goldstein actually talks about this concept of the emotional life of words.
Yes, he does.
Do you remember that?
I do.
Where he's saying that words actually carry all of these additional, unspoken emotional connotations.
Yeah, he uses the word beach as an example.
Yeah, I love that example because he's saying, the dictionary definition of beach is pretty neutral, right?
Yeah, it's just like a shore of a body of water.
Yeah, that's not very exciting.
No.
But for most people, the word beach evokes all of these positive associations with relaxation and, vacation and summertime and all that stuff.
Exactly. And so he's saying, for me, the word beach doesn't necessarily carry all of that baggage.
Right.
It's just a word that describes a place.
Interesting.
And so you can see how that would lead to misunderstandings. Someone says, I'm going to the beach. And you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, you're not getting all of that emotional subtext.
Right.
You're speaking different languages almost.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it.
And it's not that one way of communicating is better or worse.
No.
It's just different.
And
I think that's the key taatakeaway, right? Is understanding those differences.
Yeah.
So that we can be more mindful in the way that we interact with each other.
And more patient.
Yes.
Because sometimes it does take a little bit of extra effort to make sure that we're understanding each other.
And these communication differences also extend to information processing.
Yes, they do.
Goldstein talks about how neurotypicals tend to process information in a very top-down conceptual way, whereas he has this more detail-first approach.
Exactly.
So he's starting with the details and then building up to a more comprehensive understanding.
It's like building a house brick by brick.
Yeah.
Rather than starting with a prefabricated structure.
I love that analogy.
And he argues that this can lead to a lot of misunderstandings because, autistic individuals might be perceived as being slow or not getting it.
Right.
When in reality, they're just taking a different route to arrive at the same destination.
Yeah, it's not that they're not intelligent or capable.
Oh.
It's just that they're processing the information in a different way.
And they might need a little bit more time to get there.
And this also makes me think about how, we talk about autistic people having these special interests.
Right.
And maybe it's not so much about the interest itself, but about that depth and intensity of focus.
Yeah.
That ability to really absorb and analyze details that other people might just overlook.
Right. And Goldstein even draws a comparison to AI models. He talks about how he builds these conceptual models from detailed information.
Uh-huh.
And this allows him to see patterns in a more holistic way.
So instead of just seeing individual data points, he's like connecting the dots.
He's seeing the big picture.
He's seeing patterns that other people might not even be aware of.
Exactly. He's seeing the forest while other people are focused on individual trees.
That's a great analogy.
And I think it's a really powerful example of how these different ways of thinking can actually be strengths.
Yeah.
We often talk about neurodiversity as a deficit.
Right.
But Goldstein's really helping us to see that it's also an asset.
So we've seen how Goldstein is really reframing these core ideas around autism.
Right.
He's challenging this deficit-focused model.
Yeah, and he's highlighting these unique strengths and perspectives of neurodistinct individuals.
Absolutely.
But I think the big question now is how do we actually translate this into concrete actions?
Right, like how do we actually create a society that is more inclusive and neurodiversity affirming?
It's easy to talk about these things in theory.
Yeah.
But how do we put them into practice?
Like, what does that actually look like?
And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
It seems like we talk about, inclusivity a lot, but in very abstract terms. Like, what does it actually look like, in practice? And specifically for autistic individuals, like, what are some concrete changes that we could make?
Yeah, Goldstein really emphasizes that we need to shift from trying to fit square pegs into round holes,
right,
to creating environments that can actually accommodate a diversity of shapes.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that what works for one person might not work for another.
Okay.
And designing spaces and systems that are flexible and adaptable.
So it's about having options.
Exactly.
Not about, everybody needing to conform to a single standard.
Right.
I like that. So can you give me some practical examples of what this might look like?
Sure. So in the workplace, for example.
Okay.
This could mean, offering flexible work arrangements, providing clear and concise instructions, creating sensory-friendly spaces, really understanding that sensory sensitivities are real,
right,
and can have a big impact on an individual's ability to focus and be productive.
So instead of having like a one-size-fits-all office environment,
right,
you might have, options for quiet workspaces,
exactly,
adjustable lighting, maybe even the ability to work remotely.
Yeah. All of those things can make a big difference.
And then in educational settings, what could that look like?
So it could involve incorporating a variety of teaching methods to cater to different learning styles. Maybe allowing students to demonstrate their understanding in ways that go beyond traditional tests and written assignments.
Because really recognizing that intelligence and ability they manifest in different ways.
They do.
And valuing those differences.
Exactly.
Rather than trying to, force everybody into the same mold.
And Goldstein makes a really important point here.
Right.
He says, this shift in thinking isn't just about making accommodations for autistic individuals.
Okay.
It's about creating a better world for everyone.
Oh, interesting.
When we design environments that are more inclusive and accessible, we all benefit.
It's like the curb cut effect, where you design something for a specific group, but it ends up having all of these positive ripple effects.
Exactly. And that's what Goldstein is really calling for. He's saying neurodiversity is not just an individual trait.
Okay.
It's a societal issue.
Interesting.
We need to look at the systemic barriers and the societal expectations that are limiting opportunities for neurodivergent individuals.
So it's not about, individuals adapting
right.
to a neurotypical world.
It's about changing the world.
Wow.
To be more inclusive.
That's powerful.
Yeah, it's a big challenge.
It is.
But I think it's one that's worth taking on.
Do you think Goldstein is optimistic about the future?
I think he definitely sees a need for change. But I also think he recognizes that we're making progress.
Okay.
He sees the increasing awareness and acceptance of neurodiversity as a positive sign.
Yeah.
And I think he really believes that, understanding the neurocloud model can help us to move from awareness to action.
This has been such an insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
Really challenged me to think differently about, autism and neurodiversity as a whole.
Yeah, me too.
So what's one key takeaway that you hope listeners will walk away with?
I think the most important thing to remember is that we all share these basic human traits.
Yeah.
We just express them in different ways.
Right.
And if we can really embrace that diversity,
Yeah.
imagine the possibilities, you know?
I love that.
We could create a world where everyone feels valued and respected and empowered to contribute their unique talents and perspectives.
What a great thought to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Tim Goldstein's work.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a fascinating exploration of neurodiversity through an autistic lens.
Absolutely.
And for all of you listening out there,
Yeah.
we encourage you to, keep learning, questioning, engaging in these conversations about how we can create a more inclusive and neurodiversity affirming world.
It's up to all of us.
Thanks for listening.
We hope that you've enjoyed another episode of Life in a Neurotypical Universe. Please, if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends. Go take their phone and subscribe them. Heck, it will help us all out. If you want to know more about neurodiversity or have any questions for me, you can reach me at my website, timgoldstein.com, where I'll be more than glad to help you as best I can to navigate through the neurotypical universe.